I invite us on the patio just to kind of take a moment, and you as well sharing from wherever you're watching, to just take a moment and to breathe in the calm of Shabbat and to breathe out all the tensions of the week. Just allow yourself to feel the ease of the moment. And now, a word from our sponsor, the provider of Shabbat. For God teaches that to live life is to live with the awareness of harmony. That's hard to do. It's hard to do because if you look at the morning paper, we have a shattered world. But the challenge of life is to live holding on to the two poles, namely to live life with open eyes, with the awareness of brokenness, and yet simultaneously to rise above, or if you will, beneath, that which is broken, and to feel harmony. And Shabbat enables us once a week to pause, to hear the birds, to feel the goodness of being in community, to be part of a flow of prayers in which we echo words across generations. The religious moment is a moment of a string, a musical string, pulled in two opposite directions at once. With that tautness, there is the capacity of a sound, of a melody, but only if there is the recognition of a balance between two poles. Our rabbis teach that there is Yerushalayim Shalmata, the Jerusalem of the earth, where there is struggle, and the Yerushalayim Shalmala, the Yerushalayim above, in which there is harmony. And the messianic aspiration is for the spirit that is always there to become more manifest in the world below, and for the world to below to be in harmony with that which is above. Well, these abstractions of paradox are on my mind, both because of our Torah reading of Parsha Shmini, and because I want to speak today about Israel and Yom HaAtzmaut in this coming week. In Parsha Shmini, there is the fulfillment of a dream. After working together as a community, the tabernacle is built. In today's Torah reading, there is the celebration of the priest bringing offerings on behalf of himself and his family and then the community. There is the moment of Aaron, Moses' brother, HaKohen HaGadol, the high priest, finding a dream realized of the responsibility and the opportunity to enable people to come close to God through the Mishkan. And it is even before the celebration is over that Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, enter into the sanctuary and they will die. We're not told what it is that happened to them in this moment of joy. And the rabbis speculate. The only thing the text says is that they brought an Eish Zara, a foreign fire. And the rabbis say, because the law right after the law, the description of them dying, is not to be drunk and enter in. So some say maybe they were partying too hardy, that they became inebriated and irresponsible and entered into the holy space. Others say that these two, Nadav and Avihu, were upstarts who were saying, we're the young people, we're the future. And they did not ask their father or their uncle for what were the guidelines for bringing offerings. They decided that they were the ones who could do it too. And therefore they brought Eish Zara, a fire that was not prescribed. And others say that rather than them having been misbehaving, it was an ecstasy that brought their soul out of their bodies, that they had entered into the sanctuary and there was such euphoria of closeness to God that their souls alighted. But what is the case is that for those who remained, for Aaron, for Moses, for Eleazar and Itamar, their brothers, there was sorrow. And so here too, there is that, that string being pulled in two opposite directions in Parsha Shmini. Joy and tragedy. And that is life. That is spirituality. That is the recognition that we have Shabbat, and we also have the awareness that it is an aspiration to experience Shabbat every day. And so Parsha Shmini ends with the rules of permitted and forbidden eating, which is to say that when you live in this tension, that musical sound are the rhythms, the habits, the religious discipline of daily life that links you to both aspiration and the capacity to feel grounded to live in reality. And so Parsha Shmini, our Torah reading, we're still in transition. It's wonderful to be able to look and share this moment. We're still in transition of bringing out Torah and reading in Haftorah. But you see, we've started at 9:30. We moved back from 10 in anticipation of a return soon. Who knows, but soon, to greater normalcy. This coming week is Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaTzmaut. Those two modern holidays in our Jewish calendar are also, if you will, a point-counterpoint. Yom HaZikaron is Israeli Memorial Day, a day in which people recall loved ones who have died in service Haganat Yisrael, of enabling a state of Israel. Ben-Gurion, in his wisdom and as the founder of the state of Israel, said that the two should be coupled. I know of no other country that puts them side by side. The sense, again, that there is mourning that leads to rejoicing, to quote our psalmist, the yin-yang of celebration. And so Yom HaZikaron will flow into Yom HaTzmaut, the Day of Independence, in which from mourning there will be rejoicing. I mourned this week the passing of my brother-in-law, Dov Lassalle. I led the funeral on Thursday. Fortunately, the previous Thursday, only a week before, being freshly vaccinated, I made a trip to LA and spent a little time with Dov, who was struggling with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. When I was with him only a week ago, he was unable to speak. He had been unable to speak for several months. But quite remarkably, Dov, who was for 45 years a city attorney with the city of Los Angeles, in charge of many of their real estate deals like the downtown wholesale food market, Staples Center, bond issues, and the litigation around those things. He was a star in that regard, a man who loved to invest in property and even more importantly, to invest in people. Unable to speak to me, I sat with him and I knew it was my opportunity to do the talking. And I told him stories of my children. And at all the appropriate moments, he had the most sweet smile. He was fully present, but only after he passed. by not awaking this week on Tuesday, did his daughter tell me that he had been keeping a diary. 22 single-lined pages of a letter to his children, written with the movement of his eye, typing over the last 3 months, in which he described his life as a rocket ship in 4 stages. He said, I am now in the 4th stage of the rocket where it's bound to return and crash. The first of those stages, he said, is when I was young, born in Toronto, going to kindergarten and coming home crying because nobody else understood him. Because with his immigrant survivor parents, his only language was Yiddish. And he didn't know that other people speak other languages yet. But he would go on to speak 6 or 7 languages. He was a brilliant man. And he writes that the second stage of his life was at the age of 20, when, right after the 67 war, the Six-Day War in Israel, as a student at UCLA, he said, I'm going to go to Israel. It was the first time he had left his parents. He had left home. It was the first time for him to be traveling alone and abroad. And he said that's when his life began, in Israel. He said he could feel, as I read his memoir, he said he could feel as if there were tentacles from the earth embracing him, particularly in Jerusalem, he said, and the Negev. That was a year, as he wrote for his children, this lengthy letter, which, by the way, he wrote until the night that he passed, which is to say, he was fully present. He said that being in Israel in that year was to feel connected to Jewish history in all its fullness, but more, to be engaged with people from around the world in the current moment. He came back, he graduated from UCLA, and in law school at UCLA, he said to the dean, I'm going back, I'd like to go back to Israel for my last year. And the dean said, we don't have any programs in Israel. He said, I'll work it out. And he got a job with the Attorney General's office and set up 3 legal aid clinics that year, which he was able to parlay into coming back and finishing his law studies. But clearly throughout his life, Israel was at the center of a sense of a variety of qualities of what it means to be a Jew. His father lived in Poland before the war, and during the war at the beginning walked from Poland to Istanbul overland and then took a boat to Israel. His mother was a survivor as well. And as I am also a child of survivors, there's a sense, maybe more emotionally, that when I hear Hatikvah, I am aware that the horror of the war and the murder of Jews was due in part to the fact that we did not have our homeland, that we did not have a place where we could go. And that Israel, as I shared last night, is not because of the Holocaust. Israel is because of a 2,000-year longing of a homeland, of Jewish dignity, of self-governance. But it was enabled by the guilt that was the political reality of the aftermath of the horror of World War II. And so for my brother-in-law, for whom a trip to Israel meant, in the writing to his children, the beginning of his life, a phase of his life, of being both an independent person, but more, somebody who had experienced fully a connection more profoundly to belonging than he had had before. I share this because he's very much on my mind, but also because Israel is very much on my mind. There was an editorial this week in the New York Times by Tom Friedman, in which he deals with the gridlock in Israeli politics. And he says in that regard that Israel only is a foreshadowing in so many ways of what will happen and is happening in other Western countries, including ours, of political gridlock in which people distrust and in which things don't move forward. Today, Shabbat, is not the time to talk about that gridlock, but it is to acknowledge the tension between those who look at Israel and do so with two false lenses. Namely, only to define Israel by the dream, and then to say it's the biblical homeland and they're not acting like saints, therefore they are terrible people. That is also a distortion. And those who are to see Israel as only another country without a country tied to Jewish memory, to Jewish history, to the yearning for goodness. Because Jerusalem has as its center the word shalem. It is the aspiration of wholeness. Amos Oz can say it is the earth that has shed and held the most blood, and simultaneously be the country and the place, far and wide as a religious symbol of the yearning for peace. And so, to live knowing how Israel engages our imagination, to know that when we go to Israel and we walk its streets, those are the streets that led to the Holy of Holies, that is where the temple stood as a symbol of God's closeness to earth. To be in Jerusalem is to know that is the place where Isaiah heard the angel say, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzvaot. Holy, holy, holy is the ever-present one of force. To be in Jerusalem and to stand at the holy wall is to know that it is not the wailing wall, but the holy wall. A wall that today we can call the wall of celebration, not the wall of tears. The name, the Wailing Wall, was given by those who saw Jews generation after generation on pilgrimage, standing at the outside of the courtyard wall to the temple, crying, praying, yearning. That today is the place in which soldiers for Israeli units celebrate as 18-year-olds, as 19-year-olds, their capacity to defend them and more. It is where world leaders come. And whether they are a president or a pope, they walk to that same wall that we should call the wall of celebration. And they write a note, which is a custom of only several hundred years, of seeing the Kotel HaMaravi, the Western Wall, as God's mailbox. And they'll write a little prayer and place it there between the crevices of those mighty stones. Because we are privileged to be the ones responsible for a place that is identified as a place of yearning of the deepest spiritual kind, the yearning for peace. Ribono Shalom, Master of the universe, my life too began when I went away as a 18-year-old to Israel. going to back off doing my closing prayer and sing to you one song, a closing song, and then another closing song. 1 second. I too, not unlike my brother-in-law Dov, came of age in Jerusalem. I'd been on a kibbutz when I was 16 years old, a religious kibbutz with cousins. And I said, I'm going to come back. But it was the days before internet, and the only program I knew of was the junior year abroad. So I quickly finished high school while still in high school, began to attend college, began the junior year abroad, but that was my first beginning of college, which meant everybody was 2 years older than me, and I was small. In any event, it was the year that I came of age, of being away from home, 1972. And in living in the dorms, I met students from all over the world. I took a class in singing Israeli folk songs, living on Mount Scopus, the mountain that overlooks the old city. That old city, 1972, only 5 years afterwards, where things were so hopeful. And I remember as the cab came at the end of the year to take me away, it was just before sunrise, and Jerusalem was covered in clouds. And as we began to drive away, I looked out at Jerusalem, and the tops of the hills were sitting in clouds. And I began to tear up. For that year, I had many experiences as a young man, but I had also fallen in love with Jerusalem. And there was a song I learned in my folk song class that came to my mind in that moment and that I replay now. First, the words in English. From high atop Mount Scopus I gaze and bow low in rapt adoration. From the heights of Sophim I sing of your praise, Jerusalem, pride of our nation. Through ages untold I have dreamt of your story, to be worthy of seeing you rekindled glory. Yerushalayim, Yerushalayim, your radiant treasures make plain. Yerushalayim, Yerushalayim, your ruins I build once again. Me'al pisgat har hatzofim, eshtachaveh apayim. Me'al pisgat har hatzofim, shalom lach Yerushalayim. Me'adorot chalamti alayich, liskot lirot be'or panayich. Yerushalayim, Yerushalayim, ha'iri panayich livnech. Yerushalayim, Yerushalayim, mechavotayich evnech. Ribono Shel Olam, Master of the universe, we are individuals and we are community. You are far and you are near. We live our lives pulled and yet whole, needing to remember your presence, even when it requires imagination. For 2,000 years as a people we wandered, but we always hoped. No matter where we were when we prayed, we faced toward Yerushalayim, yearning, hoping to regather in dignity as a community. I invite us to rise in honor of Yom Ha'atzmaut this week as we sing the song of hope, Hatikva.
Kol balevav pneima nefesh Yehudi הופיע. עוד לא עבדה תקוותנו, התקווה בת שנות 2000, להיות עם חופשי בארצנו, ארץ ציון וירושלים, להיות עם חופשי בארצנו.